Under the freezing night of the Arizona desert, a man ran in panic, his shirt soaked in sweat, but still holding tightly to the girl's hand. Behind them, the darkness seemed to swallow everything. What were they running from? And why, in the midst of all the panic, did he not let go of her hand, as if her life was the only thing he had left to protect? That night, under faint moonlight, bounty hunters led by scarred snakes surrounded a small Apache village at a Red Hill's base. Amid cries, Snake laughed hoarsely, raising his dagger to claim the father's head. $10 a head, Snake bellowed, his voice thick with liquor and greed. Tonight, I'll be rich. Tommy, a new recruit from Fort Cobb, passed by with his squad. Sergeant Palmer watched coldly. Let them work, he said. Fewer Apaches, better for us. Tommy's blue eyes fixed on a girl clutching a knife, her gaze fierce. She charged at Snake. The knife aimed at his chest, but he was quicker. A strong punch knocked her down, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. Snake laughed, raising the knife. This little girl is worth $10 too. The hunters cheered. His comrades whispered about money, but Tommy's heart tightened, and he acted. He charged forward. A powerful shove made Snake stumble, his knife falling to the ground. You bastard, Snake roared, pointing his gun at Tommy. You want to die for her? Behind him, Palmer yelled, Hagen, stop! Don't interfere with the bounty hunters! But Tommy didn't move. He stood in front of the girl, his hand tightly gripping the rifle, his mind in turmoil. Why was he doing this? He didn't know who she was, didn't understand why he couldn't stand by and watch her die. In a world where an Apache head was worth $10, enough to buy alcohol and cigarettes for a month, why had he chosen to save her instead of turning away like everyone else? The girl looked up at him, her gaze a mix of surprise and suspicion, but she said nothing. And then, as if mocking fate itself, the sandstorm suddenly struck. The howling wind roared, the dust swirling, engulfing the battlefield. Tommy didn't hesitate. He grabbed her hand, pulling her into the darkness, leaving behind Snake's curses, Palmer's cold stare, and everything he had once believed in. Now, it was just the two of them, a betrayed soldier and an Apache girl, alone in the desert, with hundreds of hunters chasing after them. He had chosen a path with no turning back. The cold blade was pressed against Tommy's neck from the backside, the girl's breath warm and hurried against his face. White man, she said in broken English, her voice trembling with anger mixed with pain. Why did you save me? He swallowed, his heart pounding, unsure how to answer her question. I don't know, he replied, his voice hoarse from thirst and fear. I didn't want you to die. She gave a bitter laugh, her eyes sharp like the knife she was holding. Lies. The white man always wants us to die. For money. For land. I didn't shoot, he said, meeting her suspicious gaze. She then sheathed the knife, shoved him to the ground, and the red dust clung to his coat. Go. She turned away, her voice cold. Before I change my mind. Tommy scrambled to his feet, but he didn't run. He looked around. The desert stretched endlessly, only the howling wind through the dry rocks breaking the silence. Do you know the way to Fort Cobb? He asked, his voice trembling. She frowned, her expression once again filled with disdain, then pointed toward the distant darkness. That way. Go and die. But he knew he couldn't go alone. Without water, without food, and without a guide, he would die before dawn. Can you lead me? He pleaded. It seemed he could feel the contempt in her eyes, and the mixed emotions there. Why should I help the enemy? She asked. Tommy took a deep breath because he knew she was right. He took off his military jacket, still stained with dust and smoke, and tossed it on the ground as if giving up his identity. I'm not your enemy, he said. I'm Tommy Hagen, just a lowly soldier. She remained silent for a long moment, her eyes scanning him from head to toe. Finally, she turned away, walking without saying another word. Follow me, she commanded, but if you betray me, I'll slit your throat. Tommy nodded, quickly following her into the night, his mind still troubled, questioning himself. Had he done right by his own faith? The girl introduced herself as Awanita, a name she didn't explain, but Tommy guessed it must hold some significance in Apache, perhaps a memory or symbol of her people that he would never fully understand. She spoke little, only signaling with her hands as they crossed jagged rocks and dry ravines, her steps light yet decisive like an animal familiar with this desolate land. Tommy tried to keep his distance, his hand always near the rifle on his hip, not because he truly wanted to shoot her, but because he wasn't sure if he could trust her. He had been trained to trust no one but his comrades, especially people like her, The natives he had been taught were mortal enemies. At Fort Cobb, Tommy was taught Apaches were savages to be eradicated. Palmer recounted massacres like Dry Creek, claiming they're not human, only threats worth $10 a head. Tommy, like the others, had nodded along, not because he truly believed it, but because he dared not question it. He was taught that loyalty to the squad was everything, that any hesitation before the enemy, even women or children, could get him branded a traitor and shot on the spot without trial. Veterans bragged of cutting ears as trophies. Tommy's stomach twisted, but his faith forbade slaughter. But now, walking alongside Awanita, his heart was in turmoil. The training he had received, that she was a wild beast, that she deserved to be wiped out just for her bloodline, seemed to fall apart in the face of the reality before him. She wasn't like what Palmer had described. She didn't snarl, didn't attack him immediately. Though the knife was still within her reach, as if with the slightest move from him, she would slit his throat. She remained silent, leading him through the desert with the vigilance of a survivor. Tommy wondered if everything he had been taught was true, or if it was just a justification for the conqueror's brutal actions, designed to make him, a mere pawn in this game, question himself. The first day, Awanita silently led him to a hidden stream, showing him how to dig for water. He glanced at Awanita as she washed the dried blood from her arm, the marks from the massacre in the village where she had killed 2 soldiers before fleeing. Your family. Tommy hesitated, wanting to break the silence between them, but she immediately looked up, her eyes flashing with anger. Don't ask, she cut him off. You have no right. Tommy lowered his head, nodding slightly, realizing he had accidentally touched a wound in her heart. He dared not look at her again, his own heart heavy. The stories Palmer had told about the Apaches, that they didn't know love, didn't have families, only knew murder, now echoed strangely in his mind, but they conflicted with the pain he glimpsed in her eyes. Was her family still alive? Parents? Siblings? He didn't know. The raw truth was standing right before him, and he wondered if he was truly on the side of righteousness. If he were her, would he have the courage to keep going? That night by a fire, Tommy said, I sought freedom, also bloodshed. Awanita didn't respond right away. She sat quietly, gripping her knife, her gaze fixed on the fire. After a while, she spoke bitterly. To get something, you have to sacrifice. Your freedom is our death. You brought your gun here and took everything from us. Tommy lowered his gaze to the ground, unsure of what to say. The next morning, they discovered horse tracks on the dry earth. The marks left behind were certainly not from cavalry, but from bounty hunters. Awanita tensed. No one is more bloodthirsty than these men. They hunt us like animals. For money, $10 for a head. The girl bitterly mocked. You know, it's so cheap. Aren't we human? Tommy gripped his rifle tightly, his lips pressed in resolve. I won't let them capture you, he said, a steady determination creeping into his heart. His words surprised her, and she looked up, asking, Why? After a pause, she added, You've betrayed them. They'll surely kill you. Because I don't want any more blood to spill, he answered. I will survive. At noon on the third day, under a blazing sun, Tommy and Awanita crossed barren land. A gunshot shattered the silence. Tommy flinched, his hand instantly reaching for his rifle, but before he could react, a group appeared. Snake, the scarred bounty hunter, along with 3 of his henchmen, riding toward them like a pack of hungry wolves. Snake, a tall, scarred man with a face burned red by the sun and liquor, his murky eyes flashing with greed, pointed his pistol directly at Awanita. He sneered, his voice growling like a predator. $10 for my prize, Apache girl. You run fast, but not fast enough. Tommy shoved Awanita aside as Snake fired, the bullet grazing his shoulder. He fell, clutching the wound, eyes fixed on her. Awanita wasted no time. With an angry, desperate yell, she lunged at Snake. The dagger in her hand flashing in the sunlight. Her movement was as quick as a hunting leopard, the blade aimed directly at his chest, but she failed again, just like before. He grabbed her throat with his muscular arm, squeezing tightly until she could barely breathe, the knife falling to the ground with a hoarse gasp escaping from her throat. You think you can kill me? He snarled, his face twisted with fury and pleasure. His 2 henchmen laughed loudly, raising their guns to assist, but they didn't get the chance to act. Despite the blinding pain, Tommy crawled across the hot sand to reach his rifle, just a few steps away. He grabbed it, his hands trembling from blood loss, aimed it directly at Snake, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed, and the bullet pierced Snake's chest, causing him to fall to the ground, blood pooling into a dark red puddle on the sand. He let out one final scream before falling silent forever. The two henchmen, panicked by their leader's sudden death, spurred their horses into the desert, their hooves fading into the dust. Tommy dropped the rifle, his breath ragged, his head spinning. He dragged himself to Awanita, who was now kneeling on the ground, clutching her throat and coughing violently. He drew the dagger from his belt, cutting the ropes that Snake had tied around her before he died. "Why?" she whispered, teary-eyed. "To protect you," he rasped, clutching his wound. He didn't say more, but in his heart, the true answer was far more complicated. He hadn't just saved her for her life, but because of a feeling he couldn't name, a feeling that had sprouted the moment he pushed her out of the line of fire in that burning village. Awanita fell silent, then tore a strip from her long tunic, her trembling fingers bandaging his wound. She worked with an unusual care, her rough hands gentle, as if afraid of causing him more pain. When she tied the cloth around his shoulder, she whispered, barely audible, "I believe you're not like them." Tommy looked at her, feeling the warmth of her hand spread through the blood-soaked fabric, and for the first time he saw a different light in her eyes, a glimmer of gratitude. That night, by a fire, Tommy rested, fever eased by Awanita's care. She sat across from him, the firelight dancing on her face, highlighting her strong features and deep eyes. After a long silence, she began to speak, her voice low and slow as though each word weighed heavily. "My father was a chief," she said, her eyes fixed on the fire. "He was killed in the village, the night you were there. They shot him in front of me, then burned everything." She paused, swallowing hard. "My brother, he ran, but I don't know if he's alive or dead." Tommy listened, his heart heavy as he recalled that night. The gunshots, the cries, and the look in her eyes when she rushed at the bounty hunter with nothing but a knife. "I'm all alone now," she said, the pain flooding her gaze, her hand gripping the dagger as if holding on to the last piece of memory. Tommy reached out, taking her hand, feeling her cold fingers tremble in his. "No, you have me," he said, his voice steady, even though his heart was still in turmoil. She didn't pull her hand away, and in that moment, between the flickering firelight and the cold desert night, the invisible thread of fate began to bind the two people from two opposing worlds. On the fourth morning, Tommy and Awanita found a valley with a stream and pines. His wound festering, he collapsed by the water. Awanita knelt beside him, her hands deftly checking the wound, her face betraying a worry she tried to hide. "Don't do this," Tommy whispered weakly, trying to sit up, but she pressed him back down. "Stay still," she ordered, her voice firm but quivering. She took some herbs from a small cloth pouch at her side, dried leaves she had gathered along the way, and crushed them with a stone, applying the mixture to his wound. Tommy grimaced as the burning sensation spread, but he didn't resist. He watched her work, her rough hands gentle but skilled, moving with the expertise of someone who had survived much loss. "Who taught you this?" he asked, trying to distract himself from the pain. "My mother, before she died," she replied briefly. That night, under a full moon, Tommy rested against a pine while Awanita gazed upward. She began to sing, a soft Apache song, her voice rising and falling like the wind over the desert, carrying sorrow and loss. Tommy listened, his heart seeming to stop for a moment, drawn into the melody. "It's my mother's song," she said, as if she knew what he was wondering, her voice small but clear. "About the days when we were free." He looked at her, the moonlight softly illuminating her face, highlighting her strength and the eyes that no longer held the same coldness as before. "I wish this moment could last forever," he whispered, wondering if it was a confession. Awanita turned to him, her gaze wavering. Then she lowered her head, her lips brushing his forehead. A tentative kiss, like a dragonfly skimming the water. Tommy reached for her hand, pulling her closer, and this time their lips met in a deep, intense kiss, carrying the pain of the past and the fragile hope of the present. He felt the warmth of her, the scent of earth and smoke wafting from her long black hair, and in that moment, all boundaries between them seemed to vanish. But that happiness was short-lived. The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke, the sound of hooves broke the peace of the valley. Tommy jolted awake, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle, but before he could rise, his squad appeared on the northern hill. Sergeant Palmer dismounted, his face red with anger, the pistol in his hand aimed straight at Awanita's forehead. Tommy stood, though his body was still weak, stepping in front of Awanita, gripping his rifle but not raising it. "Private Hagen, get out of the way. This is an order," Palmer bellowed. "This savage must die. You know the law." "I'm sorry, sir," Tommy said firmly. "I won't let you kill her." Palmer sneered, his cold eyes locking onto the traitor. "You've lost your mind, Hagen." Do you know what this is? Treason against your country? I could shoot you on the spot right now." The other soldiers circled them, their guns aimed at both, their eyes torn between loyalty to Palmer and shooting their comrade. Awanita gripped Tommy's hand from behind, whispering urgently, "Run! They'll kill both of us!" Tommy looked at Palmer one last time, the commander's gaze like a death sentence. Then he turned and pulled Awanita into the woods. Gunshots rang out behind them, a few bullets whizzing past the trees, but luckily, they managed to escape thanks to Awanita's knowledge of secret paths between bushes and rocks. They ran until the sound of hooves faded, stopping by a small stream, breathless and exhausted, but with hearts still beating strong. They had each other. After fleeing, Tommy and Awanita stopped by a forest stream. He rested, aching, while she gazed toward the desert. The air between them was heavy, no longer filled with the silence of suspicion from the early days, but the silence of two people who knew they were at an inevitable crossroads. She turned to look at him, her sun-kissed face now marked by the pain she could no longer hide. "We can't continue," she said, as if she had been thinking about this for a long time. Tommy looked up, his blue eyes wide in shock, her words striking straight into his heart. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice faltering, his hands instinctively clutching the grass beneath him to steady himself. He stood up, walking towards her despite the sharp pain in his wound. "We can run away," he said, his voice urgent, almost pleading. "We can find somewhere no one knows. No one will find us. Just the two of us." Awanita shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, but she held them back. She stepped out of the stream, facing him, her hands clenched into fists as if to stop herself from being weak. "Don't you understand, Tommy?" she said, her voice breaking. "You don't belong here. And me, I don't belong in your world. The crowded streets you talk about, the wooden houses, the white people who look at me like I'm an animal, I'll die." She paused, taking a deep breath, her gaze pained but unwavering. "Can we hide forever? They will find you, the army, the bounty hunters. They will hang you for betrayal, or they'll kill me for $10. We have nowhere to go." Tommy stepped closer, his hand touching her shoulder, but she didn't move. "I don't care," he shouted, his voice breaking, tears beginning to roll down his face. "I don't want to lose you, Awanita. I'd rather die than go back without you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if that was the only way to keep her with him. He felt the warmth of her body, her heartbeat pounding under the rough fabric of her clothes, and in that moment, he wished time could stop forever. But Awanita didn't respond. She stood still in his arms, her hands limp, and when she spoke, her voice was small but firm, like a knife cutting through his heart. "I feel the same, Tommy," she whispered, her tears finally falling, silently soaking into his shirt. "But I have to let you go. If you stay, you'll lose everything. Your family in New York, the life you had. If I follow you, I'll lose myself, what's left of my tribe, my father, my brother. We can't fight it." Tommy let her go, stepping back, his hands trembling as if they no longer had strength. He looked at her, his eyes red and swollen, his heart shattered as he realized the truth in her words. He knew staying meant being hunted as a traitor by his own society, but looking at Awanita, he couldn't imagine a life without her, the one who had made him feel alive for the first time. They stood there, only a few steps apart, but as if they were worlds apart. Awanita stepped forward, placing her hand on his cheek, her cold fingers gently caressing his skin. "You have to live, Tommy," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Go back to Fort Cobb. Don't die for me." He took her hand, gripping it tightly as if holding on to the last bit of warmth. "What about you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She smiled faintly, a bittersweet smile. "I'll find my brother. That's my path." They embraced one last time, their tears soaking into each other's shoulders, hearts breaking in the face of an unchangeable truth. Tommy kissed her forehead, his lips trembling as they touched her skin. Then he let go, turning away to walk, each step tearing apart his soul. Awanita stood there, watching him disappear into the forest, her tears silently falling into the stream, blending with the cold water. Tommy returned to Fort Cobb, enduring the punishment of hard labor. The days passed in quiet solitude, each strike of the hammer against stone reminding him of the memories of Awanita. She was still out there somewhere, in the vast desert, continuing her search for her brother, the one he couldn't save. On long nights, she sat beneath the moonlight, singing a song full of regret, echoing in the wind like a painful confession, the rhythm of a longing that would never fade. The love between them, though intense and deep, had been torn apart by societal prejudices, like a flame burning brightly but unable to keep warm for long. Tommy's heart broke remembering her, their love a wound unhealed by a divided world. And so, their story ended in silence, each walking their own path, carrying lost memories and wounds that would never heal. The love between them was a dream, beautiful yet brief, and could never become reality.